You're watching BBC World News. I'm Jonathan Charles. Our main stories so far this hour. The French President, Nicolas Sarkozy, has urged his cabinet to stand firm on its new policy towards the Roma community. Last month, the President announced plans to dismantle unauthorised campsites and repatriate ethnic Roma gypsies, prompting international condemnation. 33 miners trapped underground in Chile have now been told it could take until Christmas to get them out. Our correspondent there, Gideon Long, has been telling me the miners who've already spent weeks underground have accepted the news.
These are experienced miners. They know this mine inside out. They know that the main exit to the mine has been blocked, and also that the ventilation shaft into the mine has been blocked. And so they also probably know as well that it will take a long time to dig through 700 metres of solid rock. So maybe not too much of a surprise, but it must have been disappointing news all the same to hear that they might be down there until Christmas.
Also, the European Union has accused Iceland of threatening the survival of mackerel stocks in the Atlantic through overfishing. Scottish fishermen say they're particularly worried about the Icelandic action. Now it's time for our newspaper review. Aaron and I are looking at the stories making headlines around the world today, and as we've been reporting, the Guardian's business pages say a record low for sales of new homes in the United States has sparked fresh fears of a double-dip recession. The paper says speculation is growing that federal bankers will need to step in to prop up the fledgling recovery. But the Fed is apparently split over how much support is needed and when.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a double dip, but there's still some big money out there because the Financial Times says BHP Billiton has challenged rivals to come forward and match its near $40 billion takeover bid for the world's biggest fertiliser company. That's Canada's Potash. The paper says the firm's share price, that's Potash's share price we're talking about, has lost some of its upward momentum. The gain since the bid was launched 9 days ago, falling to just under $146 per share on Tuesday.
After that good news, now the bad news again. The Irish Times says the cost of state borrowing has risen sharply after the ratings agency Standard & Poor downgraded Irish debt. The S&P rating for Ireland is now at its lowest level since 1995. But the paper says the government agency managing the state debt has criticised the downgrade as flawed.
And the China Daily says Hainan Airlines has grounded all of its flights for 3 days after the crash in Ichun, in which 42 people were unfortunately killed. The paper tells some of the extraordinary stories of survivors who managed to escape the blazing wreckage.
And Dubai's Gulf News reports that Britain's enhancing the security features of new passports, which will feature some of the country's most famous landmarks, such as the White Cliffs of Dover and Ben Nevis.
Huh.
There we are then. Well, earlier, Aaron and I were joined by Bundeep Singh Rangar, chairman of the Indian consultancy firm IndusView, and I started by asking him for his reaction to that Guardian story about the fresh fears of a double-dip recession in the United States.
New home sales are down 12%. It's the lowest it's been since 1963 when they began recording data. And existing home sales are down 27%. So you've got, on the domestic front, nothing really great happening. Exports are down. The U.S. dollar has, of course, suffered as the euro strengthened in the past few months. The euro is up 6%. So there's no really good news story here, either an export-led recovery or domestic consumption. And that's the real fear, that this double-dip recession is U.S.-led, with no clear signs of break in the sky.
Isn't the same problem, Jonathan and I, we've been talking about this over, the last week or so when we get these economic data through from whichever economy. Problem is, the growth that we've seen has been artificial growth because it's all off the back of this.
It's not really self-sustaining, is it?
It's not self-sustaining. So when is the time, I always bang on about this question, when is the time to say enough's enough with stimulus, let nature take its course? As tough as that might be.
Right. So there's a couple of lessons here. I guess one, you can look at the European example, because the recovery in Europe was probably better than people anticipated. Just a few weeks ago when we were here with the Greek crisis, things were looking very dismal. And while Europe interfered, it actually said, look, let's cut down deficit and debt to our stated levels of 60% debt to GDP and 3% current deficit, and reduce the stimulus side of it. It created more of a sort of a parameter for success. In the U.S., I think you've had, from TARP onwards, continuous government-backed stimulus packages, and now you've kind of got to let the baby walk on its own feet.
There's not much stimulus money left in the US, right? They've spent, and there's not a lot of political appetite either to put more in.
Absolutely.
So
and they're not getting much more from BP, so you can't.
yeah, you can only.
But I tell you what's interesting, I think, in this Guardian article, and again, another sign of how serious the issue is in the United States. It says that a lot of companies are reducing their capital investment, and therefore that's another sign that they're not investing enough in the economy. They don't have enough confidence in the future of the economy to really promote economic growth.
Absolutely, and I guess the question is, what does the U.S. Federal Reserve do from here? Because in the past, that's been the key instrument. Interest rates, of course, have been the key instrument for them to create that environment for both confidence and growth. And now it's really a challenge because they're at the lowest rates ever, and I guess political will is what's needed, but running out of tricks here in some ways.
Just one final thing on this. I mean, you say that a few minutes ago, this is the U.S. leading the way into a double-dip recession. That makes it sound obviously as though there's going to be global fallout from that.
Well, look, I mean, I'm in Asia. I was in India for 2 weeks just last week, and the economy there is roaring. They're looking at 9% plus growth, and they're still second to China, which is still, a couple of points ahead. So I don't believe the world is the same as it was the last time around in a recession, or the recession of the 70s, or what have you. This is much more of there's a differential here. The Asian rates of growth are continuing and heading actually more optimistically. I think the U.S. has got particular points.
This is the mature economy problem, isn't it?
I suppose so, yeah. It's a brick versus the mature economies.
So more sheltered. They're more sheltered from the U.S., if you will.
Yeah, and they are more sheltered. The exports are not necessarily only to the U.S. They're domestic consumption. India is a 70% domestic consumption economy. And in many ways, they're not constrained by what happens in the U.S. They've got their own domestic-led exports as well.
Just quickly, if not Asia then, but if the U.S. sneezes, do we get a cold?
We're so closely attached to it. I mean, you look at Germans, the economy in Germany is so optimistic right now because their sales went up. Well, guess what? The euro was down. BMW, Mercedes sold more cars. So,
Okay, let's move on. Financial Times, BHP, they've been in the news, about 9 days since that bid for potash. It's been quite bold now. It's saying, come on, put your money where your mouth is. It's telling rivals, come and match it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, my home country, Canada, so here we go. One of I guess the top 5 companies by market capitalization, 20% of the world's supply of potash, which is now being used increasingly for fertilizers and crop growth. I don't see anybody else who can really come down and say, here's $40 billion, boys, and here, take the offer or leave it, and who's going to outbid BHP for all the synergy that they have with the company as well. So I think he is looking kind of cushy, saying shareholders, 20% shareholdings changed hands in the last 2 weeks. So we know there's some kind of activism going on in the shareholder base to potentially support this bid without any other rivals.
Since you're, can I ask this? Since you're from Canada, because there is, I've been reading, there's a raging debate in Canada, because over the past decade, there's been a lot of foreign companies buying up Canadian resource companies. How is this being played out in Canada? Have you been hearing?
Yeah, well, I guess we're not the most economically nationalist when it comes to our resources. 80% of the Canadian economy is somehow tied to the U.S., if not owned by the U.S. But Canada is the biggest place for listing mining stocks. 60% of all world's mining companies are listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange. So we're a great place for accessing capital when it comes to mining or resources. Not necessarily that protective, but owning the assets themselves. Because I think we're just a good place for finding more and getting access to capital.
Yeah. All right, let's have a look at this Irish Times story. Back to the economic gloom after a bit of an upbeat note there, and that is that the cost of state borrowing in Ireland has actually jumped because they've had a credit downgrade. But actually the wider story is they've got a lot of banks which are still in deep trouble.
So the original assumption was 35 billion euros to kind of bail out the Irish banks. Now it's up to 50 billion. So that's a jump of 20% or something or more. But also the outlook is what looks negative. So the downgrade is one thing. They're now at a AA negative, which is sort of number 4 down the investment grade list. But the outlook is looking bad, partly because of the cost of bailout. And they have this government-backed securities that are rolling over next month worth about 50 billion euros. So the question is, will the government continue to back them? And what will the cost be of refinancing that if they have to roll it over further?
That was Bundeep Singh Rangar, and from the two of us for the moment. Bye.
See you soon.